It was winter, the kind that settles into your bones and reminds you that nature, for all its beauty, is indifferent to human squabbles. I'd plowed my driveway, a routine task in our little corner of the world, pushing the excess snow onto the far edge of a shared easement, a strip of land technically common but practically an extension of my yard's border. This minor act of snow displacement, it turned out, was akin to high treason in the eyes of Mildred McMillan, president of the esteemed Oakhaven Homeowners Association. She declared it interference with access, a phrase dripping with self-importance, and proceeded to issue a public notice of eviction, taped not just to my door but, with a flourish of theatrical malice, to the community bulletin board by the mailboxes. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Mildred McMillan had just picked a fight with a retired appellate court judge, and I don't lose battles. Especially not when the battlefield is a courtroom. The audience includes 3 local news cameras, and Exhibit A is the HOA's own meticulously labyrinthine and fatally flawed bylaws. The sheer audacity was breathtaking, a monument to petty tyranny. Eviction, for snow, my snow, on land I partially maintained. The notice itself was a masterpiece of amateur legal drafting, riddled with errors a first-year law student would blush to commit. My wife, Sarah, found it first, her face a mixture of disbelief and indignation. "Arthur," she'd said, holding the paper as if it were contaminated, "you need to see this." I saw it, and in that moment, the quiet retirement I'd envisioned, filled with books and grandchildren, receded. A different kind of engagement, one I thought I'd left behind, beckoned. This wasn't just about snow, it was about the sanctity of one's home, the rule of law, and the insufferable arrogance of a petty dictator who'd mistaken a $5 plastic gavel for a scepter. The stakes were clear: my home, my peace, and the unspoken precedent for every other resident cowering under Mildred's reign. The game was afoot, and Mildred, bless her overzealous heart, had no idea she'd just invited a grandmaster to a game of checkers. She saw a retiree. She was about to meet the man who'd written opinions that shaped state law. The chill in the air suddenly felt less like winter and more like the opening bell. My initial response was measured: a carefully crafted letter delivered by certified mail, return receipt requested. It outlined the simple facts. The snow posed no actual impediment. The easement's usage history supported my actions. And, most critically, their eviction notice was procedurally defective and substantively baseless, according to their own governing documents. Specifically, Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 2, which detailed the precise and unmet conditions for access interference. I even included a photograph of the minuscule snowdrift with a yardstick for scale, looking pathetically unthreatening. It was the legal equivalent of a polite cough, a gentle reminder that they were, to put it mildly, mistaken. Mildred McMillan, however, was not one for subtlety or self-correction. Her reply, when it came, was a masterpiece of escalating absurdity. Hand-delivered by a scowling man I vaguely recognized as her vice president, a perpetually aggrieved individual named Gary, it was typed in an aggressive, all-caps font and festooned with exclamation points. It dismissed my points as legalistic grandstanding, an accusation I found rather rich, and doubled down on the eviction, adding a fresh demand: immediate removal of the offending snow, a $500 fine for willful defiance, and a written apology to the HOA board for my disruptive behavior. Sarah read it over my shoulder, her breath catching. "She's insane," she whispered. I merely smiled, a thin, wintry expression. "Perhaps," I replied, "but more importantly, she's predictable. And she's creating a rather comprehensive record of her own incompetence." The easement itself was a curious creature of legal drafting. A 20-foot strip designated for utility access and pedestrian transit. Though, in its 30-year history, no utility worker had ever set foot on its grassy expanse, and the only pedestrians were squirrels and the occasional adventurous toddler. My property line abutted it directly, and for years, homeowners had treated their respective easement fronting portions as extensions of their lawns, mowing and, yes, occasionally piling snow. This was common practice, accepted and unremarked upon, until Mildred ascended to the HOA presidency on a platform of restoring order. Her order, it seemed, was chaos for everyone else. The beauty of bylaws, I've always found, is that people like Mildred rarely read them with the care they demand. They skim, they interpret through the lens of their own desires, and they wield them like clubs, unaware of the delicate mechanisms and counterbalances within. I, on the other hand, had spent a career dissecting far more complex documents. This was like reading a children's picture book, albeit one illustrated by Hieronymus Bosch. The dining room table became my war room. Spread across its polished surface were the HOA's articles of incorporation, the covenants, conditions, restrictions, CC rupees. The meticulously kept minutes of past board meetings, surprisingly revelatory, detailing years of inconsistent enforcement and petty vendettas, and a highlighted copy of the bylaws. Sarah brought me coffee, her brow furrowed with concern, but she knew this look in my eyes. It was the same focus I'd had preparing for a complex appeal. "Are you sure about this, Arthur?" she asked, not questioning my ability, but the toll it might take. "Mildred has chosen the terrain, my dear," I said, tapping the bylaws. "She just doesn't realize I drew the map." I enlisted the help of Ethan, my former law clerk, now a tech-savvy consultant with a delightful penchant for digital archaeology and a healthy disdain for officious bullies. "An HOA eviction over snow, Judge?" He'd chuckled over the phone. "This has your brand of quietly dismantling an absurdity written all over it. What do you need?" His role was crucial: to digitize all relevant documents, cross-reference past HOA communications, and conduct a discreet background check on Mildred and her board, looking for any conflicts of interest or patterns of abuse. Within days, Ethan had compiled a dossier that was both damning and, in its own way, hilarious. Mildred, it turned out, had a history of failed small businesses and a string of minor but telling neighborhood disputes wherever she'd previously lived. Her current board consisted of 2 sycophants and 1 visibly uncomfortable treasurer who, according to meeting minutes, frequently abstained from controversial votes. Meanwhile, Mildred continued her campaign. A second fine notice arrived, this one for failure to comply with a board directive. The penalty now, $1,000. Then came a newsletter, distributed to every home, titled "Maintaining Our Community Standards," which, without naming me directly, pontificated on the importance of unobstructed common areas and warned of firm action against repeat offenders. It was slander, carefully worded but unmistakable in its target. My neighbors, initially sympathetic but cowed, began to avoid eye contact. The isolation was a calculated part of Mildred's strategy, I knew. She wanted to make an example of me. She was succeeding, just not in the way she intended. Each misstep, each overreach, was another nail in the coffin she was unknowingly building for her own authority. The file on my dining table grew thicker. My patience, a finite resource even for a retired judge, wore thinner. The scent of battle, long dormant, was invigorating. The next communication was not from me to Mildred, but from my newly retained legal counsel, a sharp young attorney named Ms. Albright, from a respected local firm, to the HOA's registered agent. I could have represented myself, of course, but the optics of a third-party professional delivering the blow carried a different weight. It signaled that this was no longer a personal squabble but a formal legal challenge. The letter was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. It detailed, with surgical precision, every bylaw violated by the HOA in their handling of the snow incident: improper notice, exceeding fining authority, defamatory publication, and attempting an eviction without due process or legal standing. It cited specific state statutes governing HOA conduct that had been demonstrably breached. It demanded the immediate rescission of all fines, a public retraction of the defamatory statements in the newsletter, and a formal apology. Crucially, it put them on notice. Any further attempts to harass, fine, or proceed with the unlawful eviction would result in immediate legal action seeking damages, legal fees, and injunctive relief. We included a discovery request for all communications related to my property, all financial records pertaining to fines levied and collected over the past 5 years, and the minutes of any board meetings where my case or similar cases were discussed. This was the gauntlet. Mildred's reaction, relayed to me by a grimly amused Miss Albright, was entirely predictable. She'd apparently received the letter, glanced at it, and declared to her board, according to a source Ethan had cultivated, the aforementioned uncomfortable treasurer, "He's bluffing. Lawyers always send scary letters. We hold firm." She then instructed the HOA's own attorney, a semi-retired real estate lawyer named Mr. Henderson, who primarily handled closings and clearly wanted no part of complex litigation, to send a dismissive, one-paragraph response, reaffirming their position. It was the tactical equivalent of walking into an obvious ambush with a brass band. The fines continued to accrue on paper, each notice arriving with a smug little addendum about escalating penalties. Mildred, I mused, was the embodiment of the Dunning-Kruger effect, her confidence soaring in inverse proportion to her competence. The trap wasn't just set. She was tap-dancing in the middle of it, blissfully unaware of the closing jaws. The beauty of her arrogance was its thoroughness. She left no stone unturned in her quest to incriminate herself. My inner monologue became a running commentary, a dry, almost amused catalog of her errors. Each new HOA missive was exhibit next, in a case she was single-handedly building against herself. This wasn't just about snow anymore. It was a clinical dissection of hubris. The turning point, the moment this shifted from a tactical legal chess match to something more visceral, arrived on a blustery Tuesday morning. Sarah had gone out to retrieve the mail. I heard a small, sharp cry of distress. I found her standing by our mailbox, her face pale, holding a new notice from the HOA. This one wasn't about fines. It was a notice of intent to place lien on our property for the accumulated, unpaid, and entirely illegitimate fines. Taped below it, with what could only be described as malicious glee, was a crudely printed flyer featuring a grainy photograph of our house, circled in red, with the caption, "This property in violation. A threat to community harmony and property values." It had been stuffed into every mailbox on our street. This was no longer just bureaucratic overreach. This was a direct, personal, and public attack designed to shame and intimidate. It was an attempt to damage our reputation, to turn our neighbors definitively against us. It was a moral violation. The cold, calculated anger I'd kept leashed within me tightened into a diamond-hard resolve. Mildred McMillan had just made this intensely personal. She had targeted my home, my sanctuary, and in doing so, had threatened the peace Sarah and I had worked a lifetime to build. "That," I said, my voice dangerously quiet as I took the flyer from Sarah's trembling hand, "is a declaration of war she will live to regret." The image of my home, defaced by that red circle, burned into my retina. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was about defending my family's dignity. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. My strategic inner commentary shifted from amused observation to a grim tally. This act, this public shaming, was a gift. In her blind fury, Mildred had handed us incontrovertible proof of harassment and defamation, far exceeding the initial snow dispute. She was no longer just an incompetent HOA president. She was a reckless antagonist, actively seeking to inflict harm. The game had changed. The gloves, such as they were off. The methodical accumulation of evidence now had a sharper, more urgent edge. The quiet satisfaction of anticipated legal victory was now underscored by a righteous fury. She had aimed for our reputation. She would find hers in tatters. The following morning, Miss Albright filed a comprehensive lawsuit in county court. The defendants were the Oak Haven Homeowners Association, Inc., and Mildred McMillan, personally, in her capacity as president and as an individual. The causes of action were numerous: breach of contract, the CC rupees, breach of fiduciary duty, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a request for declaratory judgment to nullify the fines and the lien threat, plus injunctive relief to prevent further harassment. We sought actual and punitive damages, along with all legal fees. The summons, a crisp, official document that brooked no argument, was served upon Mildred McMillan at her home by a stoic county sheriff's deputy. Ethan, who had a friend in the sheriff's office, his network was impressively diverse, gave me a play-by-play. Apparently, Mildred had answered the door in her bathrobe, accepted the papers with a dismissive sniff, and then, upon realizing what they were, had turned a rather alarming shade of puce. Her air of invincibility, Ethan reported with satisfaction, had visibly crumbled. The news of the lawsuit spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. Suddenly, my previously avoidant neighbors were finding excuses to stop by, offering hushed words of support, sharing their own stories of Mildred's petty tyrannies. It seemed my stand had uncorked a well of suppressed resentment. The local newspaper, alerted by an anonymous tip, "Thank you, Ethan," ran a small piece on page 3. Local HOA, sued by resident over snow dispute. Allegations of harassment. The accompanying photo was, ironically, the one Mildred had circulated of my house with the red circle, but the context was now entirely different. The narrative was shifting. The online community forums, previously dominated by Mildred's pronouncements, buzzed with speculation. 3 local television news crews, smelling a classic David versus Goliath story, or, more accurately, a story of bureaucratic overreach with a colorful antagonist, dispatched reporters. They interviewed a flustered Mildred, who offered a rambling, incoherent defense, and then sought me out. I declined an on-camera interview, referring them to Ms. Albright, who issued a calm, professional statement about seeking to protect her client's rights. The public spectacle was precisely what Mildred had sought to inflict upon me, now turned back upon her with interest. The sheer weight of a formal lawsuit, the public scrutiny, began to exert pressure. The HOA's semi-retired lawyer, Mr. Henderson, promptly filed a motion to withdraw as counsel, citing an irreconcilable conflict, and privately telling a colleague he wasn't about to get his own reputation shredded, defending the indefensible. Mildred was learning, perhaps for the first time, that actions have consequences beyond the echo chamber of her own board meetings. The cinematic quality of her unraveling was almost poetic. The discovery phase was where the HOA's carefully constructed facade began to disintegrate under legal scrutiny. Ms. Albright, armed with my detailed understanding of their internal documents and Ethan's digital forensic findings, issued a series of devastatingly precise interrogatories and requests for production. We asked for every email, every text message, every note pertaining to my property and the snow incident. We demanded detailed financial accounting for all fines levied and collected, cross-referenced with records of expenditures. We subpoenaed bank records. What emerged was a portrait of breathtaking incompetence and vindictive pettiness. Emails between Mildred and her board showed a clear, premeditated campaign to make an example of me. Financial records revealed that fine income was often used for discretionary spending by the board, including meeting expenses at surprisingly expensive restaurants. There was no consistent policy for fine assessment or collection. It was entirely arbitrary, often targeting residents who had previously questioned Mildred's decisions. Ethan, meanwhile, had been busy. He'd discovered an online forum from Mildred's previous neighborhood, where she had been similarly embroiled in disputes, eventually being asked to step down from their version of an HOA after a series of contentious incidents. He also found that Mildred's own property had several minor, unaddressed CCR violations, precisely the kind she was fining others for. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was ammunition. The HOA, now scrambling to find new legal representation willing to take on such a rapidly sinking ship, was slow and obstructive in its responses. Their eventual document production was a mess, incomplete, disorganized, and clearly trying to hide the most damaging information. Ms. Albright filed a motion to compel, which the court granted, along with a stern warning to the HOA about discovery abuse. Each legal maneuver, each document unearthed, was a small, satisfying click in the mechanism of justice. Mildred, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, was becoming increasingly erratic, railing against the unfairness of it all in hastily called, poorly attended board meetings. The pressure was visibly taking its toll. Her public pronouncements ceased. The community bulletin board, once her personal billboard of power, now featured only lost cat posters and advertisements for bake sales. The tide had irrevocably turned. The unearthing of this rot was not just about winning a case. It was about exposing a systemic abuse of power that had poisoned our community for too long. The cold fury I'd felt had settled into a steely determination to see this through to its logical and just conclusion. The day of the hearing for our motion for summary judgment arrived crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the metaphorical storm brewing within the Oakhaven HOA. The courtroom was surprisingly full. My neighbors, emboldened, had turned out in quiet solidarity. The 3 news cameras were back, their lenses, like predatory eyes, fixed on the defendant's table where Mildred McMillan sat, flanked by a harried-looking young lawyer who had clearly drawn the short straw at his firm. Mildred attempted an air of affronted dignity, but the strain was evident in the tight set of her jaw and the restless tapping of her fingers. I sat with Ms. Albright, a file of meticulously organized exhibits before us. The judge, a pragmatic woman named Henderson, no relation, mercifully, to the HOA's former counsel, with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, called the case. Ms. Albright rose and began her presentation. Her voice was calm, her arguments precise, laying out the undisputed facts, the HOA's clear violations of its own governing documents and state law, the pattern of harassment, the defamation. She moved through the evidence systematically. The initial snow complaint, my polite response, Mildred's escalating threats, the illegal fines, the public shaming, the libelous flyer. Each point was supported by an exhibit. Exhibit A, the bylaws. Exhibit B, the eviction notice. Exhibit C, the photographic evidence of the snowdrift. Exhibit D, the defamatory newsletter. Exhibit E, the lien threat and public flyer. It was a methodical deconstruction of Mildred's entire campaign. The judge listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a sharp question for the HOA's counsel, whose responses were increasingly hesitant and vague. He seemed to be realizing, in real time, the utter hopelessness of his client's position. Mildred kept trying to whisper instructions to him, her face flushed, until Judge Henderson fixed her with a silencing glare. My own internal monologue was one of quiet satisfaction. This was the culmination of months of patient, precise work. It was the law, in its majestic and impersonal power, being brought to bear against arrogance and abuse. There was a certain beauty to it, like watching a complex equation resolve itself. When Miss Albright presented Ethan's findings regarding Mildred's own unaddressed CC/R violations and her history in a previous HOA, a low murmur went through the public gallery. The HOA's lawyer objected weakly. "Relevance, Your Honor," but was overruled. "It speaks to a pattern of conduct, counsel," Judge Henderson noted dryly. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Mildred looked smaller, somehow, her earlier defiance shriveling under the weight of the evidence. The masterstroke, if one could call it that in such a sordid affair, came when Ms. Albright presented the HOA's own internal communications obtained through discovery. Emails where Mildred explicitly instructed her board to make an example of me, to crush any dissent, and one particularly damning message, where she dismissed concerns about the legality of her actions with the phrase, "Legal, schmiegel, we're the board, we decide what's right." The news cameras zoomed in on Mildred's face as these words were read aloud. Her composure finally shattered. She visibly flinched, then began to mutter audibly, "That's taken out of context. They're twisting things." Judge Henderson banged her gavel sharply. "Mrs. McMillan, you will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom." Mildred subsided, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The HOA's lawyer, looking utterly defeated, offered a feeble defense, arguing that the board had acted in what they believed to be the best interests of the community, that their interpretation of the bylaws was merely different, not malicious. It was unconvincing, even to him it seemed. Judge Henderson took less than 10 minutes to review her notes after oral arguments concluded. When she returned, her expression was stern. "The court finds," she began, her voice ringing with authority, "that the plaintiffs have overwhelmingly met the burden for summary judgment on multiple counts. The actions of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association, and specifically its president, Mrs. McMillan, demonstrate a clear pattern of harassment, defamation, and abuse of authority, flagrantly disregarding its own governing documents and established law. She systematically dismantled each of the HOA's defenses. She declared the fines null and void, the lien threat illegal, and the attempted eviction baseless. She granted our request for injunctive relief, permanently barring the HOA from taking any further punitive action against me concerning this or any similar matter without court oversight. She awarded us full recovery of our legal fees. Then she turned her attention to Mildred. "Mrs. McMillan," she said, her voice laced with judicial ice, "your conduct has been an embarrassment to the concept of community governance. You have wielded your limited authority like a bludgeon, terrorizing residents rather than serving them. This court strongly suggests the members of Oak Haven reconsider your fitness to hold any position of authority." The cameras flashed. Mildred McMillan stared blankly, the architect of her own public ruin. Justice, televised and unequivocal. As we left the courtroom, the reporters swarmed, but I simply nodded towards Ms. Albright, who handled them with practiced ease. The real victory wasn't just the legal win. It was the public exposure of tyranny, however petty its domain. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Mildred McMillan resigned from the HOA board within 24 hours. A terse, one-sentence email circulated to residents. Her reign was over. The remaining board members, thoroughly chastened and facing a wave of resident anger, scheduled an emergency community meeting. It was a raucous affair, by all accounts, with years of suppressed grievances finally aired. A new interim board was elected, comprised of residents, including the once uncomfortable treasurer, who were committed to transparency and fair enforcement. They immediately moved to review and revise the bylaws, ensuring clarity and establishing robust oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses. The news segments that aired that evening were brutal for Mildred, replaying her courtroom humiliation and Judge Henderson's scathing remarks. The online forums lit up with a mixture of relief and a call for broader reforms. Our legal fees were paid promptly by the HOA's insurance, a final, tangible acknowledgement of their defeat. The most profound change, however, was in the atmosphere of Oak Haven. The cloud of apprehension lifted. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers, but openly. There was a renewed sense of community, forged in the shared experience of overcoming a petty tyrant. My little snowdrift, the catalyst for this suburban drama, had long since melted, but the easement it once occupied became, in a small way, a symbol, not of defiance, but of the simple right to peace and quiet enjoyment of one's property, free from arbitrary interference. Sarah and I resumed our quiet retirement, the books and grandchildren taking center stage once more. The dining table was cleared of legal documents, replaced by jigsaw puzzles and Sarah's gardening plans. Occasionally, a neighbor would stop by, not with fear, but with a plate of cookies or an offer to help with yard work. Life returned to its proper rhythms. As for me, I sometimes walk past the community bulletin board. It's a riot of local news, bake sale flyers, and lost pet notices. No more edicts, no more threats. Just the mundane, reassuring pulse of a neighborhood at peace. And I reflect, with a certain dry amusement, that sometimes the most effective way to deal with a bully is to allow them, with meticulous legal guidance, to thoroughly and publicly defeat themselves. The snow, after all, was just snow. The principle, however, was everything.